All right. Looks like we are up and running. Let me go ahead and get everything switched over to the right layout, and we will get started with today's jam stream. There we go. Let me do a little bit of a kind of an overview like we usually do at the top of the stream about what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm just going to put on a real quick beat that I threw together while we were getting everything loaded. Hey, Sarahlad's here. Saralad says, Beatbox with Twiz? Twiz? Is that different from Riz? When I hear Twiz, I think of Twizzlers, which are not bad. But welcome, Saralad. How you doing today? Hopefully you're having a good Sunday. All right, let me know if I need to tweak anything with sound. I think we're coming in about normal. Make sure the audio's not super loud. The setting I need to be careful about here whenever I'm doing stuff with the loop is EQ. If it's too high, then it gets fuzzy. Sorry, lad says I'm good, and you? I'm good. I woke up like more than 2 hours before the stream today. It's a miracle. Enough time to eat lunch and get ready. All right, so what are we going to be doing today? I was doing some thinking last night, usually 1 or 2 days before these jam streams are live. I try and figure out what I want to talk about and come up with kind of a rough, not necessarily lesson plan, but just an idea of stuff that I want to talk about on the technique and sound theory side, so that I'm not just, scrambling around the day of or during the stream itself, figuring out what I'm going to talk about. And so I do have an interesting sort of extension of something I mentioned 1 or 2 streams ago. I can't really remember, but it'll be focusing on breathing techniques. And I know we've brushed on the topic very briefly in previous discussions, but I wanted to dedicate a section of the sound theory talking portion of today's stream into going more in depth and talking about some of the things that I've learned since I first started beatboxing. And so I think that'll be interesting, especially for people who are interested in getting into it. I came up with some interesting ideas to kind of demonstrate that stuff. So that'll be what we talk about after we get through intro and warm up. And then depending on how long it takes to get through all that, with the remaining time, we'll work on some BGM stuff for our upcoming projects. And fortunately today I'm not on a real strict schedule, so I have a bit more time than normal to hang out with all of you. All right, let's go ahead and turn this off. And so we're gonna start with warm up. I'll run through some real quick kind of freestyle beats back to back, get the blood flowing into all of my face anatomy, and then from there we will go into the technique and sound theory discussion. And I'll be checking sound levels as we go and make sure everything sounds all right. All right, let me up my mic gain a little. Hopefully I'm coming in loud enough. Just let me know if I need to fix anything. Starlet says, I missed the solar eclipse yesterday, and you? Yeah, funny you mentioned that, because I remember a lot of people talking about the eclipse. Where I live was not clear weather yesterday. It was pretty rainy. And so even if I wanted to go look at the eclipse and I had the gear for it, it was cloudy, like completely overcast and raining. So that would have made it pretty difficult. I should look up some footage of people talking about it. So yeah, I didn't get to see it either. But must have gone off without a hitch. I don't think anybody sacrificed all their friends to the God hand. So that's good. keyboard and my chords out of the way here. All right. To warm up, let's go ahead and get started. Oh, it's warm in here. All right, sound levels look all right. Not seeing anything peaking too high. Ooh, voice crack. But I did notice that some of my snares, like my Ks or my BGMs, do yellow line my audio readout. So I got to be a little bit careful where I'm pointing those. But I think sound wise, we're all right. And so kind of continuing on, I'm going to change the caption. And I wanted to point out a few things when it comes to the sound theory and technique discussion that goes along with what I was mentioning at the top of the stream when it comes to breathing techniques. So let me go ahead and change the caption real quick, and we will talk about that. There we go. So the concept of breathing and air control is something pretty important for beatboxing. And hopefully, if I get a chance to talk through it and explain some ideas that I was kicking around when I was thinking about the stream yesterday, hopefully it'll make sense and serve as a good sort of introductory conceptual tool for people, again, who are interested in getting into beatboxing. And so one thing that's worth pointing out when it comes to breathing, when I did that series of practice beats, it was like 5 or 6 minutes or so of just random freestyle beats chained together and put in no particular order, no particular rationale, just beats and sounds to warm my face muscles up. For the most part, maybe the exception of the very last one, I didn't stop to breathe once during that whole thing. I'll have to listen back to the footage later. Maybe there were a couple instances where I did sort of kind of like a short breath type thing, but overall, if you compare doing a beat and then having to stop either on rhythm or just to break the beat up completely and take a breath, I didn't do that through that entire warm-up exchange. And so that's kind of what I wanted to spend some time talking about when it comes to the techniques and how I've sort of been able to focus on it and use that to improve my beatboxing. And so we'll start kind of at like a basic level for breathing techniques. And it's going to sound kind of elementary, but I think it'll make sense if you kind of go through the ideas and the concepts. So if you've ever done wind-based music instruments or sang, a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about here has direct parallels to those types of music creation because they fundamentally behave the same way. In beatboxing, you are the instrument, or specifically your mouth and your face are the instrument. But for a good portion of the sounds that you make, not all, but a good portion of them in the basic toolkit, they are driven by air. You need to be able to breathe in order to make the sounds, otherwise there's no sounds and you will keel over because you're not breathing. Sounds pretty simple. But when it comes to beatboxing, one thing that people have to learn compared to, singing and again, wind instrument playing is how to manage and regulate the air that you have and are intaking and expelling. I'll try and use consistent terminology here, but intake and I'll say intake output. That's a little bit more natural in my brain. So the idea of intake and output when it comes to air is really important, especially when you start building complexity and more intricate routines and things that you're doing, because obviously things that require more exertion and more effort are going to a lot of times consume more air, and you have to be able to balance it. Otherwise, you will run out of air and you'll have to break whatever you're doing. And when you're just learning, I think it's probably not that big a deal to just drill specifically for breathing. But one thing I wish I learned, because I learned just watching YouTube tutorials and eventually I took some lessons, but this was probably when I was in the intermediate phases as opposed to just starting out. I wish I did more research on breathing because I just kind of learned it over time. If I had some of this information at the beginning, it would have made things a bit easier. And so that's what I'm kind of going to try and talk through today in order to, again, give people some resources if you're just getting into beatboxing or curious, that'll hopefully help and form good habits so that you can learn faster and improve faster later. So the first thing that I picked up from one of my teachers, actually I only have had one teacher, my old beatboxing teacher, is actually a warm-up exercise that he recommended in one of his beginner tutorials, and it seemed really handy and useful. So I wanted to repeat it here as part of this discussion on breathing and air management when it comes to beatboxing. And he was a tuba player, I think. Played a low brass in band. And so he already had kind of background in wind instruments and breathing. But one thing he said for warm-ups is really good practice for any skill level, and it's something I try and do every once in a while when I remember, is to just start off practice by doing deep breathing for maybe 5 or so minutes. You don't have to spend like half an hour doing deep breathing, but the purpose of that is, one, to warm up your lungs and kind of condition your body to be able to do the things you're going to be doing, but also it's training your body for endurance and overall supply of air in the long term. And so the way he kind of broke it down, if I remember, you just take a deep breath in through, I don't know if it really matters if it's through your mouth or your nose. I think either is fine. The point is to take as deep a breath as possible and then hold it and then breathe out slowly. You don't want to just go quick inhale, quick exhale, because then you're going to hyperventilate. But in practice would be something like just a deep breath and then out. And it sounds very simple, but in doing this repeatedly and trying to get as much air into your lungs as possible, you hold it and then just gently let it out, and then repeat that in like a rhythmic cycle for about 5 minutes, over time, it helps improve your lung capacity. In addition to warming up, which is good, the main point is to give your lungs more capacity over time so that you can hold your breath longer. You can have more air in control as you're doing things. And that's one thing I did notice, because I used to play a wind instrument like 30 years ago, but now I don't do that anymore. But I do sing, or I like to sing. I wouldn't say I do it well, but I do like to sing. And so I've kind of had to learn about air management and breathing through that. But even adding on just breathing exercises here or there, as I was learning beatboxing specifically, did help. It did help my lungs kind of up their capacity and give me more control. So I think that's a really beneficial thing for anybody at any skill level to do every once in a while, and just practice and condition, because you don't want your body to be deficient on air at any point. Well, in general, because you'll die, but for beatboxing specifically, having that kind of control will just help. It'll help a lot. And so the first tip when it comes to air management is do breathing exercises. And it's actually really good for stress management too, especially if you're the type of person who gets overwhelmed easily. Sometimes taking a step back from whatever it is, if you can get a minute or 5 minutes, get away from whatever it is that's stressing you out, and then just do some deep breathing exercises and kind of try and recenter your brain. It is helpful. And so again, tip 1, breathing exercises are good for any skill level and are pretty important for helping give you more resources when it comes to managing air. The next kind of tip that I wanted to break down is having a mental map of the type of sounds that you know and do and employ in beatboxing, and knowing roughly how they affect your air resources. Be they things that are taking air away when you're breathing outwards or making outward sounds, or on the flip side, when you're making sounds that are inward, be they vocalized bass sounds, like inward bass, whether they're inward lip rolls, whether they're inward drags, which we're going to definitely talk about later. Having an idea of roughly how each of the sounds affects your air one way or another, or not at all, is also really important. And depending on how a person thinks, I would say you don't necessarily have to write it down and write like a complex flowchart or a spreadsheet. But if you're the type of person like me who kind of inventories things in order to remember, like we talked about the sound inventory spreadsheet, which is all of my sounds that I know, I use that to kind of mentally check the whole usage of air when it comes to remembering those sounds. I don't use it to just have like an air meter or like a rating. I don't really do it that way. But in keeping a list of things, I also mentally keep a list of how things affect air. And so it seems like a kind of abstract recommendation, but if we break it down into really kind of simple terms, into what that means, put the idea of the lesson into practice instead of me just rattling things off. If we were going to do a random beat, and let me think of what makes the most sense as far as illustrating the point here. Let's focus on a pretty much completely external air beat, just to keep things simple to start. So maybe your beat sounds something like every component of that, from the kicks, the hats, to the PF snare, are all external output sounds, if you want to classify them that way. The hats probably use the least amount of air because it's just your tongue, but even still, just the you can kind of do it without using any air, but for me, instinctually, is a little tiny bit of air pressure. The kick and the snare, to me, are the ones that are using, quote unquote, the most air outwards. And so again, thinking of the practice beat, everything in there is taking air away from your supply, breathing out in some capacity for the majority of that. If you were going to be stringing this beat into a longer pattern and or routine, your brain is going to have to figure out, if we're doing this for, let's say, several measures instead of just, 2, and maybe we're adding a technicality filler or something in between, kind of mix things up. Before we even get to that point, you have to think, okay, if I'm going to be doing this beat, even if it's just the beat unaltered the way I demoed it, where do you breathe? And at what point is it going to become mandatory to breathe, lest you pass out on your feet and run out of air? And so the challenge of it, one, depends on the speed of the beat, the tempo. For something simple, you can usually break up the measures with a beat, or a breath rather, if you need to. But sometimes you're going to be doing something that's so complex, you don't have the ability to just stop and breathe without breaking the whole thing and pausing it, essentially. And so one tool that I wanted to kind of explain at greater detail than what we said in the past is additional sounds or tools that are going to get air back and sort of equalize. The whole end goal is to more or less equalize your air usage so you're not either running out or intaking too much. And that's a little bit more tricky, so that's why I wanted to talk about it. So here's an example of a way you can come up with a bit more of an equalization just for that really simple beat. So again, it goes. And, unaltered does that forever. One way that I like to mix in an intake type of sound when I know it's primarily output based is a low, loose inward lip roll, which works well for things that are going to have like a heavy bass anyway. And so low, heavy inward lip roll sounds like, you heard me do that one in the practice beats towards the end. That one is really handy because one, it's doesn't require a lot of exertion to do, and because it's so loose and low, it actually results in a lot of air coming in. And depending on how intensely you do it and for how long kind of determines how much of an air break you're essentially getting there. But in the practice beat example, okay, if we throw it in there after maybe 3 or 4 repeats of the main rhythm, then it's going to give us some air back after doing nothing but expelling it for the majority. Again, sounds simple, but hopefully as we kind of talk through examples, it'll make sense for why it's useful when it comes to air management. So let me demonstrate what I'm talking about. I'll do the beat for several sections, and then I'm going to mix in the inward lip roll, the low, and sort of kind of demonstrate, and we'll circle back and see what that means for the overall air management. All right. I understand today's discussion is going to be kind of technical, but I think it's really interesting when it comes to developing tools for the Beatbox kit. So hopefully people find it interesting. Okay, so let's do the sample beat, and we're going to mix in low inward lip roll as a way to intake more air after all of the output. So it'd be. I was trying to push it towards the end just to see when I would physically be running out of air. And I think if I took that last inward lip roll and moved it a couple repeats earlier, then it would have been okay. What I was experimenting around with in the last couple repetitions of that beat was adding the technicality and seeing how that affects the air usage. And it definitely does. So we're going to probably talk about that next. But the idea that you're taking a really simple beat, and instead of pausing to stop and breathe in, you're using an intake technique, in this case, the inward lip roll, to fill the beat. Again, it's not just being jammed in as in like an awkward additional thing tacked on that was meant to be like a low bass hit, maybe something typical of a drop, but its function is to get air in. And if you really open up that and really breathe in, you can get pretty much a full breath for as long as you're doing it. And then from there, you can continue on and keep adding in the sounds, and you don't have to stop. And so again, the main point of the discussion today when talking about air management is what tools are there to help recover air in cases where you're doing a lot of output, and how to output when you're doing a lot of sounds that intake. And so we're going to look at the flip side of the example in a bit, because it does work both ways when it comes to air coming in. And again, I think it's pretty interesting how you flip the perspectives. We'll get there in a minute. But as far as increasing intake when you have primary output, an inward lip roll, pretty good example of how to do that, because again, it's very, very powerful. It slots into things pretty easily, and it will get you a lot of air back. Another one that's a little bit more simple would be to use a snare that's going to balance the input and output a bit more than just all external sounds. So this isn't flipping the methodology yet. We're still talking about how to intake more when you output more. And that's to use any of the inward snares. Specifically the inward K, I think, is the best example that I know of that works this way. So we're going to take the same beat. I'm going to try not to alter it too much. That way I'm keeping the examples consistent. But we're going to take that same beat and we're going to swap the PF snare for an inward K snare. Inward K snare sounds like sharper, a little bit breathy, and it's a bit more kind of a crisp sound to it compared to the dull kind of blunt sound of a PF snare. So updated beat with the other snare sounds like. And so on. So the difference of this one is now it is kick output sound, hat slightly output sound, snare is now an intake sound because you're breathing in when you do an inward K. It's very short, so you're not taking like a full breath, but when you do that, it is like a little micro burst of air that's created when you use the pressure to create the pop that makes the snare sound. And so now, instead of it being, if we were going to write it in notations, and let's say we said down arrow for output and up arrow for intake, just in case a visual person is wondering, it's output, 2 output, 1 intake. And so the composition of the air usage changes. And the way you kind of balance that's a little bit different, because instead of the first example where everything was just exhaled on every single sound, now you have one sound where you're getting a little bit of air back. And so the flow changes. Again, not to go into exhaustive granularity with this stuff, but the balance changes because the composition changes. And so sometimes when I want to create a pattern or a beat that's going to be something a bit more long and drawn out, if I know I'm going to be doing it for a while, because maybe it's part of a greater routine and I know it's going to be kind of more strenuous when it comes to the air involved, sometimes I will go to the inward K as my default snare in that instance because it's helping balance that output versus intake a little bit more. But to that point, going with that snare gives you more tools and options when it comes to getting air back. So in addition to just having that slotted in as the default snare in the beat, you could do something like this if you want to regulate more air and not change up the overall sound set. So let me illustrate and I'll explain what I mean. So we change the beat slightly, same sound set, but we're going to change a couple things around. So now it goes. A little bit of a regular example in practice, but by switching in more of the snares where it makes sense and then not altering the rhythm, I got like maybe a half beat off on a couple of those. But using the inward K in more spots is giving you more opportunities to get that air back. And so this is especially useful in fast patterns. This test beat is not super quick, but if we were doing it double time, we're doing like twice as fast at rapid speed, being able to control our air intake versus the output is way more important because you're moving so quickly you can't just stop unless you want to disrupt the entire beat. So like let's take that example further and convert it to like a drum and bass beat with the same sounds. So it'd be like my bad. Reverted back to the original, but with the as a filler, you could do like 3 rapid snares and elongate the sound a bit to get more breath. What I would probably do is what we're going to show as far as the drags shortly, since it makes a little more sense there, but depending on how you're adapting your beats and the tools you want to use, a lot of times it's figuring out, okay, if I'm doing something that is just expending all my air at once, it's very demanding on the resources. I've got to slot in something that's going to let me recover it and give me a chance to breathe. So again, I don't hyperventilate and pass out on my feet. And mixing in snares or slightly altering the duration of the snares is really good for that, especially the inward K, because it can go from just a to a, and you can adapt that into the song so it sounds natural. Some of the other snares, they don't function that way at all. Like you can't elongate a PF snare. You can't go, I guess you could, but it would sound weird. It'd sound like a leaking balloon. Instead, you probably would have to mix in another sound that's going to help you manage your air better. Same thing with the outwards K. That one you can't elongate because it's a short and sharp sound by default. And so again, you'd have to find out another sound to string along with it that gives you that air back. And then BGM of the big 4, same thing. You can't really elongate that one out. And even if you wanted to, you'd have to make it rapid, either doing it with single rapids or doing like a tongue rhythm rapid where it's like. And so the inward K is a little bit unique in that regard because it can be used as like a tool to alter airflow really well. And so we're talking about the idea of mixing in intake on an output type of pattern. And what I'd like to do is kind of flip the situation around in reverse and think about it from the opposite side and illustrate some examples. Hey, Ladybug's here. What's up, Ladybug? Welcome to the jam stream. We are talking about breathing techniques in beatboxing today for the sound theory discussion. Specifically, I'm trying to go through some examples of the tools that you can use for managing air when it comes to beatboxing. And we've been talking a little bit up till now about the concept of intake for breathing air in and output for breathing air out. I don't know if you've been listening for a while, so please tell me if I'm repeating myself. But the first series of examples we went through was with a beat where every component of that beat is taking air away and causing you to exhale all that air for output. And the first example was how to mix in sounds that are going to allow you to get more air in without having to stop, break up the beat, and just breathe on your own. And so it's the idea of seamlessly mixing together air intake and output so that it balances more or less and it keeps you from passing out. And so when I say flipping the example around, let's look at an example where the way the beat's constructed is a lot of inward intake instead of output. Make sure I'm using my terms correctly here. So instead of the majority of your air going outwards, you're flipping the scenario around, so you're essentially breathing in more than you're expelling, and kind of how that affects things. And so this one's a little bit weird because I think it's less common for a beat to be primarily focused on the input or intake. I did come up with an example that I can use to illustrate this, but it's a little bit less common, I think. Usually a lot of the sounds in beatboxing are taking air away and they're outwards, but that's not true in every case. So that's why I wanted to show as far as what it means. Because just like the problem of having not enough air and running out and having to breathe, if you're breathing in more than you're breathing out, in simple terms, your lungs will get full. They'll get full and you'll have to expel all the air, otherwise you literally can't breathe. And the same thing will happen in beatboxing, and so you have to manage that particular scenario as well. So what does that mean? The best example I could come up with to show how exactly you deal with something like this, and I'm sure there's others that pros could probably figure out that illustrate it better, but the example that I came up with in thinking about this yesterday is like a dubstep rhythm that uses inward drags as part of the sound set. And so I got to talk a little bit about inward drags since we don't cover them a lot here on the channel. They're not a technique I use frequently, and I'm trying to work more of them in. Inward drags are pretty handy when it comes to breathing. That's why I wanted to use them in this example. But mechanically, the way you do them is very simple. You breathe in, you take your tongue, and you raise your tongue to the tip of your mouth. You don't seal it in place like you're blocking your airway, but you put it in the pathway of the air and you keep it there. I don't think I can talk while I actually do it. But you breathe in with your tongue in the way and it creates kind of a filtered sound. You can think of it like saying ha inwards with your tongue in that position. And the sound is, it sounds kind of like a cat hissing almost if you're breathing in as opposed to breathing out. But if you just have your tongue in that position, you breathe in, you could feel that it's kind of like a filtered intake of air. That's how you're getting a, without it, sounds normal. Tongue in the way for the inward drag. And if you flatten your tongue a little bit, not against the top of your mouth, but just flatten it a bit, it'll block a bit more. So it goes from to, it restricts the airway more. Basically, more or less, that's creating a filtered sound. And the other part of the inward drag, once you have the breathing in part, is you're just going to lightly tap your teeth on your lower lip, your top row teeth on the lower lip. And that sounds kind of weird, but you're essentially cutting the air off. So it's like saying an F sound, but inwards. That's a really good way I've heard some people describe it. So it's like an H or an F sound inwards, and instead of your regular cutoff, you're using your lip and your teeth to just gently cut the sound off. You're not clamping down. And so the inward drag sounds like, and the way you would use it would be to create like texture and sounds that are rhythmically linked to a beat. And so again, the example is kind of a dubstep-ish type of rhythm. We're going to go kicks, PF snare, but we're going to mix in inward drags to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about when it comes to air management. So I know it's a little bit more of a weird example, but bear with me. So the rhythm, or the test beat, is going to sound like, and this one's a little bit difficult because there's a lot of air going in. That's why I chose it for an example. But if we break it down, and I can only do it a few times without mixing in some of the stuff we're going to talk about because there's so much air coming in just from the, and so in the example, you have, and then repeated forever. This is going to lead to a surplus of air after only a few repetitions because of how much you're breathing in with the drags. Like I could do it maybe 3 times in repetition before I got to figure out a way to get rid of all the air. And so in this example, the problem is reversed in that we have too much air. We got to figure out a way to get rid of it. Otherwise we won't be able to breathe. And there's a couple different ways I've found just in practice that help me whenever I run into a situation like that. One thing is to just breathe out as part of the rhythm, which if you're kind of careful on where you place your breaths, you can make it sound like it's part of the whole thing and natural and not having to stop and go and breathe the air out, breaking up the beat. That's one way to do it. So if we were going the kind of is tacked onto the kick, it's basically making a breathing kick staggered in between the rhythm to push that air out, because it's coming in so fast, you're trying to push it out almost as fast as it's coming in and balance. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it would be to mix in a sound that's going to be output and take that air and force it through the sound in order to get rid of it faster. And you could do like a lip oscillation, like a, because that requires lung pressure and air breathing out in order to make the sound. So if we were doing that as part of the rhythm, I got to think specifically, because I didn't write this example all the way out in my head. But if we're going so the is mixed in between the rhythm as additional sound variation. It adds kind of a low bassiness to the overall sound, and that is cutting a lot of the air that we've stored as a result of doing the inward drags. Another thing that I was thinking as an example, I was trying to kind of map out again, would be to use technicality sounds in between the filler in order to, again, start chipping away at that big surplus of air we've taken in. That's a bit more difficult, but I thought about the outwards K zip combination of technicality, because the outwards K doesn't really use a lot of sound, and you can kind of use air pressure for the zip. So that would sound like, I could feel that it does take air out, but it's not a lot. So if we put it into the example, how effective would it be? I don't know. Let's test it out and see just in real time. So if we're going to add that in as a technicality filler, it would go something like, it functions all right. Thinking about it, it is not as effective as either breathing or using like a bass type sound to get the air out. You can kind of maybe mix in a breathing out with the sound, which I didn't think to try. But if we went, it's very subtle, and if you're pretty good at mixing that in, it's basically putting a little bit more air behind each of those kind of dry, quote unquote, sounds, and then you're breathing out that way too. So it's a bit of a kind of sneaky way to do that if you're kind of proficient enough with making the sounds. And I didn't even think to cover that. So mixing it in kind of stealthily is another way to do it. But barring that, with that type of example where your air is coming in really quickly and you need to get rid of it, finding a way to breathe on beat or as part of another sound in order to equalize the air is a pretty effective way to do that. And I do that in beats a lot. I don't do it really subconsciously. Sometimes I have to think about it. Sometimes it's automatic. But if I don't want to stop and break up what I'm doing, you'll hear me kind of mixing in some sharp exhales on rhythm as part of the sound in order to get the air out. And so it's two really different sides of the same coin when it comes to a lack of air in resources or an overabundance. And part of the technique and challenge is learning what to do within each scenario so that you're not having to, again, stop and either breathe in or breathe out in order to reset your lungs and keep going. And one thing that kind of occurred to me as I was thinking about how to explain all this before today's stream, when a lot of people see someone else beatbox for the first time, I know because someone said this to me like at least once. If someone doesn't know beatboxing and you do something for them, one of the things you'll hear them say is, how are you breathing? Because it's probably not very clear to someone who's new to it how all of the air mechanics works. And a lot of times if you're able to do multiple sounds at once, in someone's brain they're thinking, how is that possible? Because you think this person will need to breathe. And just that kind of random comment got me thinking about how to explain the idea of managing air balance and flow. And that's kind of how I came up with the discussion for today. Another factor that's related to both the management and tools when it comes to airflow, air supply, and this just occurred to me now. I didn't think about this yesterday, but basses. Okay, the idea of vocalized basses, specifically, we're talking about throat bass or vibration because those are the two that I use a lot. If you're doing basses as part of a beat, it changes that balance of airflow kind of dramatically because you have to use air power to create those. Thus, your output is going to be higher than if you're not doing any vocalized bass sounds at all. So what do I mean by that? If we go back to our first example of the practice beat, which was okay, all external, fairly simple beat, but our output is changed rather dramatically if we add in a vocalized bass to that example. So if we were doing something like and so in that case, just the inclusion of the bass is using more air than the original non-bass version because you're having to use your lungs to vocalize a sound and you're forcing air out as a result, naturally. In that particular case, if I was doing that for a long stretch and I knew I was going to have to breathe at some point, which you do inevitably if you don't want to just pass out on your feet, I would probably use a mix of inward drags or even like a sucker punch drag in order to get that air back quickly. And the sucker punch drag is one that I kind of came up with. I don't think I'm the first person to do it, but I kind of adapted the sound on my own and made it part of my sound set. And I don't see a lot of people do it, but that's one that sounds like whenever I get like the drop a beat redeems or I have to do a beat on the spot, you'll hear me do my really little quick intro, which some people have asked me about. That's what that comes from. So my real quick beatbox intro, if someone puts me on the spot before I start, would be. That might sound familiar for folks who've been hanging around the stream a while. I usually do that before every drop a beat. But that sound, that's a sucker punch drag, it's inwards. And so in addition to just like a regular inward drag, the which can be a triplet or quadruplet. The quadruplet one sounds like versus that's triple. Quadruple is it's one more sound, thus the rhythm changes accordingly. But if we're going to take our example of the vocalized throat bass beat and we had to get air back because we're using everything kind of all at once, you might get something that sounds like and adding in the sucker punch drags is sort of like a triplet filler and then kind of blending it with another hat to make it flow back into the main beat on its own. Again, it is another tool for getting air in and breathing in without having to stop. And you'll see me do that in a lot of things if I'm kind of put on the spot, because that comes pretty naturally since I use it all the time, but it does work. It doesn't bring in as much air as an inward drag because there's more of your airway blocked, but it does serve that purpose pretty well. The other one that I use every once in a while, I need to get better at doing this just so I don't get rusty and lose my accuracy with it, is the sound I call a whistle shot. Now I can't whistle normally. Like I need to learn, and I want to learn tooth whistles, which is another part of beatboxing. That's tooth and tongue whistles are insanely powerful, but I'm not good at them. But if I breathe inwards, I can do a whistle sound that sounds like, not the most defined whistle sound, but that's how I know how to do it. I can't do a breathing out whistle, which is what most normal people can do. But the whistle shot combines that with it's the tongue positioning for what's called a post snare, but it's not a post snare. It's kind of like a fake post snare in a way. But the whistle shot sounds like, and that kind of sharp part at the beginning makes it sound like a shot as opposed to just a without that. And so using the whistle shot in a pattern or routine functions the same way in that it's able to get a lot of air in because it's fast. And so going back to our example of how you'd use it in the beat, same example, but now I'm going to slot in the whistle shot instead of using the drags and kind of illustrate the difference. So practice beat would be and so on. And so again, it's kind of distinct as far as the sound goes from everything else in there. If you do something like that whistle shot, people are going to notice because it's very different. But in addition to mixing up the variety of the sounds and adding in a bit of flavor, as it were, it's allowing you to get more air in because that whistle sound, I know you can't see my physical face, but when I do that, that's all inwards. It's not outwards. In fact, I don't know how to do that sound outwards because I can't whistle outwards. But as a tool for air intake versus output, that's just another thing to mix up into the structure of your beat, and it's going to give you another way to get air back. Kind of in line with that, if we flip the scenario around, and this will be the last thing I sort of talk about for today because we've been going on about breathing for a while. When it comes to more tools to get rid of the air, okay, we're talking about tools to get air back, but if you have to get rid of the air, you can employ the basses for that as well, because the basses, especially the vocalized basses, use a decent amount of air in order to create the sounds. And one example I wanted to show to kind of explain that balancing of maximizing output when intake is really high is that same dubstep inward dry beat we did before. Now, in order to help get rid of the air faster, we're going to mix in vocalized chest bass as a filler sound and use that to get rid of some of the air. And so vocalized chest bass sounds like again, one of my favorites. I like vocalized chest bass a lot. I've been kind of drilling more of that lately, trying to develop the sound and push it lower. But going into the sample beat, we would have a little bit more tricky to kind of work in because the mouth positioning changes a little bit, but just doing the again, it's taking that air supply and it's pushing the air out so that you're not just having a constant buildup from all of the inward drags that's pushing your air supply higher. And you could do the same thing with like a tongue bass, where instead of doing the vocalized chest, you'd be doing like a same thing. Functions in the exact same role. It is breathing out air quickly to balance that intake with output. And so hopefully for people who are curious or interested in learning about beatbox techniques, this kind of discussion on breathing and air management and intake versus output is at least interesting. I think I'll probably be giving some thought into more things that I can work into the discussion. So this won't be the last time I talk about breathing. Maybe in a future stream, after I've had a chance to kind of think and maybe write down some more examples, we can revisit the idea of air management and breathing techniques and look at even more examples of situations where you're going to have either too much or too little air and what to do about it and different techniques you can use so that you can, again, keep your beats going and not pass out on your feet. That would be the goal. And we got a stretch redeem from Sour Lad. All right. Oh. We're almost an hour. Spent a lot of time talking about breathing. But I think it'd be a good time to move on to BGM creation. So let me change my caption, and then we will go ahead and start playing around with some ideas for future BGM tracks. All right, so for today, the setup is the same as it's been for the last few jam streams. We've got synthesizer kun here hooked up. I'm gonna turn. Oh, no, let me go take care of something. I usually have this thing up on a couple crates, so it's closer to my hands. I forgot to do that, so let me go get that set up real quick, and then we'll get started. Otherwise, it's gonna throw me off. So I'm gonna mute real quick. This will take me like 1 minute to go grab some things and loft this synthesizer. Just give me 1 sec. All right, that's better. Let me rearrange my desk slightly here. And we'll power the synthesizer on, make sure we have sound, and then I'll kind of explain what I'm looking at doing today. Let me see if I can scoot this thing up a little bit. I swear I have to wrestle with my setup every single time I do one of these streams, just because how inefficiently everything is arranged. It's not super comfortable, but we do the best we can. So we have the synthesizer hooked up, and so just like before, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my mic boosts and start putting together ideas for a track, and then we'll come back together to discuss it. Now, the first one I want to do is something that I'm working on for a project next year, a sequel to The Lost Kingdom. And not at liberty to talk a whole lot about it, but I want to come up with an overworld theme. I have one already that I need to record off of my loop that I've done off stream, but I want to give myself some choices. Because when I eventually pare down everything for the final track list, I'd like to be able to choose and maybe get some outside opinions on which one makes most sense or which one sounds better. So this first one that I'm going to try and create is going to be like an overworld BGM theme in an RPG. And so for folks here, since I know you folks play video games, if you have any source material that you think would be good to draw from, feel free to drop suggestions in the chat as far as, maybe you have an RPG you really like. And maybe it has a theme, like for an overworld theme you really like. I can think of a bunch of Super Nintendo RPGs that were in my list, and I'm going to try and take some of those ideas and kind of flesh them out into a theme here. So again, that's the end result. Let's come up with some things and see what we got. Okay, turn off the boosts, turn down my mic, and start playing around with the loops. Let's go. Oh my. We have a raid. I have to turn my boost back on momentarily. And it's a raid from Bits Blight and the Bits Blight crew. What's happening, folks? Welcome to the stream. What's up, Iconic? Bits. Hopefully your stream went well. In fact, let me give you a shout out. I was going to ask what you're playing, but let's just see if the shout out works. Ah, that's right, Baldur's Gate. I think I saw you on my live page when I was getting everything loaded. How was Baldur's Gate? Hopefully dealing with some cool and or chaotic shenanigans. Everything I've seen from that game looks really neat. It's one I want to pick up at some point, but hopefully the Baldur's Gating went well. I was just telling the folks here on stream right before I turned everything off that we're going to be doing some BGM brainstorming, and I had turned off all my mics so it doesn't distort my recordings on the loop, but our goal is to try and create an RPG overworld theme. Something you might hear in like an old school RPG video game. So that is going to be the intent. So I'll turn off my mic, which is going to get rid of the buzzing you hear because of my synthesizer, and start putting ideas together for a track, and then we will get back together to discuss the results. And so hopefully this will be interesting, especially for folks who've never been here before and have never seen me do this. So with that being said, let's give it a try and see what kind of ideas we come up with. All right. Sorry, I was waiting for everything to say before I started talking again. Let me turn off the synthesizer so that I get rid of the fuzz. I did see Sourlad's Small Raku redeem, so I tried to do it on the fly as I was looping everything. So that's why I am extremely tiny, and that's what the timer's for. I'm sure if someone were to jump on the stream midway through all that, and all I saw was a little tiny dude and out of nowhere music being played in the background, I'm sure it'd be very confusing. But that's okay. So this one, actually, this might be one like a land speed record for how fast an idea sort of materialize. A lot of times I have to really kind of trial and error noodle around with the components of a song before I get the final. And this isn't necessarily final, but again, overworld theme from an RPG. So let's kind of walk through each component of the loop and kind of talk a bit about it, right? So first track, the rhythm. Pretty standard. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the mix down a little bit so I can talk over it. I'm not competing with the sound itself. This one is actually kind of similar to one of the themes from last year, so I'm going to have to compare it and make sure it's not too similar, but it's got the bones of what I'm looking for when it comes to an overworld theme. Vaguely March-esque in its tempo. This is something you probably hear at the beginning of the game, right when you get dropped in and you're walking around with the party or characters on the overworld. That's kind of the theme we're going for here. This is like a starting overworld theme in a game. So next up we have the bass. Real simple mix of low strings and a low synth bass. When I went back towards the middle of the looping and you heard me kind of layer in that lower, kind of more resonant bass, it's actually an electronic bass that I just ran through guitar to bass to give it more of a low boost. And so that's combined with the slightly moving notes and melodies from the string section. Very simple. And I'm keeping an eye on the timer. As soon as the small timer's off, I will take that off the screen. Count down. And let me know if you folks can't hear what I'm actually playing back. Should be coming in not as loud as me on the mic. All right, let's get rid of the timer. There we go. Okay, next track, the first of the high melodies. Actually, no, 4. We're gonna do 4 first instead of 3. And I gotta hydrate from my conic. I'm gonna drink some water. The one thing I've been playing around with on a couple different projects, not just this one, is pizzicato strings, which are very light and whimsical, and they're fun. And I added them in here, kind of in rotation after the bass, and that's how you're getting this right here. Real simple, kind of whimsical, light plucking complement to the overall bass melodies. To me, it invokes kind of that light and kind of playful tone, again, walking around a map. The next up, this is track 3. This is the high string melody. So this one goes up a few octaves on the register. It uses the same instrument set as the bass line, and it's actually the same notes with one extra one added in when it goes to the higher step. So when it goes here, note 1, 2, and then it goes one note higher for 3, and then it goes back. That third note is different. Other than that, it's the same notes as the bass, just kicked up a few octaves to kind of harmonize with it. So this is 4 of the 5 tracks. Now we add the 5th one, the flute. Kind of a simple moving melody to kind of set itself apart from the strings, like all the strings, and actually it's all strings except for that track and the rhythm. Reminds me a little bit of Misty Valley from the first project, but that's not the same notes, not the same melody, but the kind of styling and where it fits in the song is kind of similar. So the way I would see this one sort of playing out in performance, when actually putting the whole thing together, I think I would want to start with the rhythm and the bass, and then slowly we layer in the pizzicato strings, and then we go high string melody, and then the flute comes in last in the rotation. The same order I just played them for you folks to demonstrate here. And then as a potential way to outro, when we get towards the end of the song, we take out the rhythm first, then we slowly meter down the pizzicato strings, and we can either fade out completely from there and then just cut it off, or we could have the rest of the instruments drop out and then we leave the flute melody last. I think that is what I did on Misty Valley. I think the last thing you hear, I haven't listened to that one in a bit, but I think the flute's one of the last things you hear on that one. So in this particular case, I don't think I would do it the same way, so it's not just duplicating ideas. I think we would fade out and then end with the last 4. The rhythm goes, then the plucked strings, and then this runs for a stretch, and then it fades out after the last repetition of the flute melody. Cut off, and then that would be the entirety of the track. And maybe towards the end of the stream, we've still got a ways to go before we're done for today, but maybe before the end I will show off one of the other ones I recorded that is meant to fill the slot of an overworld theme, and we can kind of compare because it sounds a bit different. It's a lot more straightforward march tempo, and I think it's one of the files right before this one I was working on. So if I don't forget, maybe we can revisit the theme at the end of the stream and compare and contrast. But yeah, again, shockingly quickly came together on that one. Normally, especially with these RPG ones I'm working on, it takes a lot of trial and error and noodling around, but that one sort of materialized relatively quickly. It's fortunate. I'm not always that lucky. But let's go ahead and save onto a new file, and let's do another one. All right, file, it's cleared off. Let's do a completely different genre and style for this one. I don't need to devote the entirety of the stream today to the RPG project. I just wanted to try and knock out one song that I know I need to get recorded soon. Let's kind of flip the genre and tone around. Let's do an electronic one. Let's go for something with a bit more energy. And this has been a running gag for like maybe last 2 or 3 streams here, the jam streams. Let's try and actually do something kind of more heavy and dark sounding, because I have tried and failed for like at least the last 2 or 3. When we go electronic, I say I want to create some of it more ominous and dark. It always ends up being kind of uplifting just by pure random noodling around. So let's see if we can do it this time and break the losing streak. So I'm going to go back to the synthesizer, turn off the boost to my mic, and we'll see what kind of ideas come together, and then we'll reconvene to talk about it. So let's give it a try. All right, let us reconvene. Turn on the synthesizer. Okay, this one kind of went a different arc than the last one, I think. Well, let me turn my EQ down a bit. I don't think I accomplished my mission. Thinking about, at least this is 4 of 5 tracks I managed to fill, and I was trying to think about what to do for the last one. But it's definitely electronic, and it starts off a bit kind of moody with just the bass line. As soon as the melodies come in, I think it ceases to be kind of like dark and brooding, which not my intention. Really not my intention, but I do think it's an interesting result. So let's talk through it. So the beat, pretty standard 4/4, like a techno-ish dance type beat. Something you'd hear in like older era electronic stuff. Nothing really wacky and out there. And then we bring in the bass, track 2. So one thing I've learned over the last year or so as I've been exploring the commands and the things on the loop station and tools that mesh really well together for things like electronic type songs is the slicer command, which makes its way into a lot of the stuff I make. I need to be careful I don't use it too much. But for stuff like this, being able to take a regular instrument input and then have the slicer rhythmically cut it consistently is really handy because you don't have to deal with rhythms and everything. You just turn it on, input the sound, and it does it automatically based on how you set the slicer preset. And so for things like kind of techno, dance stuff, and even synthwave, which is something else I'm trying to learn more about duplicating. It's really good for that. It's good for melodies and it's good for bass lines. So I took this is a synth bass, I think. Yeah, I think this is a synth bass with guitar to bass to give it more low end, and running it through a 16th note slicer to get this rapid rhythm for the bass line. Still, I think this is kind of on the edge of like a kind of dark and brooding type of theme. Now let's bring in the first high synth. This is high strings. Right here. Oh no, this is the beeping synth first. I'm gonna drop this one down a little bit because it's a bit higher in pitch. So this one's also using the slicer, but instead of a 16th note cut on the input, it's an 8th note. So instead of the you're hearing on the bass, it's so it stays on rhythm. It's just slower. It's less of an intermittent cut. And let me tell you, I played around with the rhythms on both of the high end parts, or not rhythms, the notes. The melodies, I kind of messed around with a lot. If you heard me noodling around as I was capturing the loops, I tried tweaking the progression of notes several times, and I don't know if I'm 100% sold on it yet, but it did yield something interesting. So now the choir synth. This one follows a very similar note progression to the beeping synth, but then switches it up slightly, like right there. The intent was to create something that was similar, but would harmonize with the beeping, so it doesn't just follow the progression of notes exactly the same. I wanted to switch it a little. If we try and take out the beeping synth, I haven't decided if I think it'd be good to switch these in and out or to have them both at the same time. That's one thing I was thinking about as I was listening to it play back several times. And this actually would have been pretty at home on the Halloween project that I've been working on. I feel like anytime you add choir synths, depending on how much of a mood and oppressive like atmosphere you give a song, they can really give something kind of like a spooky feel because it sounds kind of like ghostly voices. And so I did employ that on the Halloween project a little bit. Beatbox says, right, I see what you mean. Kind of has a tad Metroid Prime vibe. Yeah, a little bit. Kind of something that you might hear in maybe like ruins or maybe even like a fire area. Kind of sounds like Norfairish to me. Which is a problem for the overall intention of the kind of feel of the song, since even though, choir synths can create kind of a spooky atmosphere, it doesn't really do that once you add it in here. It actually sounds kind of more like almost gospel-y. And so it's not moody and oppressive. It's almost kind of more like uplifting-ish, which I never can predict what's going to happen with these when I'm just coming up with ideas. Violet says, be right back. All right, dude. I'll be here. A lot of times it's a random bag of what happens. It's just, and if a melody and idea pops in my head and I put it together, like, well, the tone is completely different from what I intended, and that's okay. It's just kind of unexpected. But you probably heard me on the track itself running the filters, kind of mess with transitions. This is running through low pass filter, which I do on a lot of electronic songs just because it's really fun. But if we want to drop the filter intensity down, it'll mute and muffle everything more until it gets really distorted. And as we turn it back up, you can hear the effect backing off. So that could be used as a good like part A to part B transition. And what I probably do in structuring how this thing would be performed and recorded, I would back off the melodies a little bit and just let the bass line and the rhythm kind of have their own moment to just be isolated. You could even drop the rhythm out completely. And do something like bring in the melody. And bring back the beat. So yeah, I imagine the structure of how this thing would be actually performed and recorded would probably play it around a bit with having different parts come and go and then come back in and then kind of layer and then back off a little bit. I don't know if I would keep a filter transition because again, I've done it a lot. I don't want to overuse the effect. Okay, let's go ahead and save. And interestingly enough, we have one open loop slot that is not full right now. And I was trying to think, and this is where I can pull some ideas from the chat and you folks hanging out. I'm trying to think of something else to add in, and I can kind of mess around with it with the synthesizer. I just need to be careful not to record it because the mic boosts will distort the synthesizer's input. But I was trying to figure out what would be a good additional layer to add. And I couldn't come up with anything on the fly. That's why that track is empty at the moment. But we have some good high-end instruments. We have the beeping synth. We have choir synth. But I was thinking maybe something a little bit more bouncy. Let me turn the synthesizer on and start kicking around some ideas. And then depending on what we come up with, maybe I will turn everything off to record it. And then I'll just turn everything back on to talk. Hey, Snake's here. I see Snake is hitting me with 3 hydrates. All right. I'll go for a lot of water. What's happening, Snake? Welcome to the Jam stream. Hope your Sunday is going well. Okay, let's turn the synthesizer on. Again, you need to be careful because of the feedback, so you're going to hear it buzzing a little bit, but that's okay. But what if we added, let me see if I can find the general synth preset, something that's not quite as high, but we can put like something maybe in between the bass line and then the high melodies so that it kind of balances. And this particular synthesizer sound set has a pretty interesting selection of synth type sounds. You've heard me use a couple of them in the tracks that we've put together up till now. But like this is what's called square lead, which sounds like something you hear in a video game. And you can filter this one pretty effectively, and it changes the way the sound comes out pretty dramatically depending on what you do. But let's put everything in play and think about maybe something we can do with this one. Let's see. So let me turn on. Maybe something in the middle. just messing around with different potential melodies that would counter what we have. We can do that. There we go. Let's turn on the high synth so we know kind of roughly where everything else we've recorded, where it falls and how it fits in. That's a possibility. And then we go down. Simple. We could do something like that. I'll turn this down. It's probably a little bit loud. I'm leaving this in. Yeah, let me try and record a like kind of standing version, just slot it in with everything and see how it sounds. And if we like it, then I can always re-record it in a sec without the boosts. Okay, top of the repeat. Okay, that's somewhat functional. I don't dislike that. Another thing we could do is follow the progression of the high melody, and we're basically coming in the middle, and we're doing kind of like a kind of harmonized version. It's not the same notes. If we did something like, adding an extra note at the beginning that goes up before it starts going back down and following kind of the same progression of musical notes. I don't necessarily dislike that either, and that could be a way to sort of set it apart. Just trying it again here. That's interesting. Let me try and actually record it for real. So I'm gonna have to turn off my boost for a second, then I'll turn everything back on. Okay, I think that does kind of blend. That blends decently well. Here, let me turn off the synthesizer so I lose the fuzz. Now, if we add in the choir synth, does it clash? Yep, it definitely does, because the melody progression is very different. So this one needs to alternate with the choir synth, I think. It works okay with the beeping synth, but not the choir synth. If I play them both, it's going to sound very, very dissonant. Okay, let's go ahead and stop, save, and take it from the top here. So let's see, for this one, I'm thinking rather than have like an empty beat like I do for a lot of the kind of electronic songs, what if we start with the bass line, then we fade in the rhythm, and then we fade in synth number 1, which is track 3. We go track 3, 4, transition, drop 4, bring in 5, so that the one we just recorded becomes part B. Let's try that. We start with the bass. Fade in the rhythm. Synth, first synth. Then choir synth, fade in. I think I want the peeping synth down a little bit less in the mix. Kind of in the background. Okay, now let's try a filter transition. And we come out of the filter transition, and then we swap track 4 and then track 5. And so the part B introduces the final synth, the third one. Then maybe for the outro, and maybe we have it alternate between the final 2 before it cuts out completely with the synth at the end. Or we could even maybe do kind of like a start and finish on the same theme, and we finish with the bass line. So everything fades out, and you leave the bass line at the end to run a couple repeats. And then when it cuts off completely to finish the track off, it ends with the bass line. So we're starting with the bass line, fading everything in, making all the changes, swapping things, creating like different parts. And then we slowly reduce down until it's just the bass line at the end again. That's another idea that we can use for kind of putting it all together. Kind of an interesting result. It might require a little bit of tweaking and polishing up a bit before I record it, but I think we have a good basis. This one was tougher to write than the last one. This one took a bit longer to start to come together, but I do like where it's gotten so far. So before we move on and get ready to wrap up, I will open the floor up to the chat for name suggestions on this one. This would be part of probably a BGM collection in the future, and maybe an electronic themed release. I don't know. But thinking of the themes, we'll go ahead and at least get 3 components here. Think of a good potential name for this one, and I'll write it down. see Iconic suggest Weary Winds. That's kind of a cool title. I don't think I have a track. I'm looking through my list now to make sure, because I work on so many of these, I kind of forget what I've named them sometimes. But I don't think we've incorporated the idea of wind into anything. Let's see. No, I don't think so. Kind of sounds like something you'd hear in like an environment where, like, to me again, it's kind of Norfairish to me a little. But the idea that it's kind of like exhaustion, I kind of get like a bit of an exhaustion vibe from this, which I think would fit for something like Weary Winds. So that's a pretty good suggestion. All right, I'm gonna write that one down. Good suggestion, Iconic. Let's see, where is my list? 4.0. Okay. The way the rhythm of the bass line works kind of makes me sound like not winds blowing, but it kind of sounds like movement, if that makes sense. The way the bass line kind of, it alternates and it cuts at that rhythm, it kind of reminds me of like things blowing around, which is weird. I didn't intend for it to sound like that, but it does seem to kind of fit. So if that's where you're kind of pulling from, then clearly we're thinking along the same lines. So good. I have written it down. It is captured. All right, let's go ahead and stop. We'll save our progress. And before we wrap up, I mentioned before when we were doing the overworld theme that I wanted to compare the overworld theme to another one that I wrote off stream. So first, let's jump back one file for folks who may have jumped in towards the tail end. We'll run through a couple cycles of the theme I just finished before this current track. And then we'll go back even further into one I wrote off stream just to kind of compare. See if folks can see what I've been kind of playing around with. So I'm going to have to turn my mic settings on for the one before this. But first, let's step back. And so let me stop here. So this is the one that we wrote before the electronic one. And so let's run through it, and then we will compare it to one of the older ones. And so that's that one. Sarlad says, Twiz? You said that earlier and you still didn't tell me what it means. I demand answers, Sarlad. What does Twiz mean? Unless you mentioned it and I just didn't see it. Iconic says, that gives me a first dungeon kind of vibe. A little. I think it's a bit kind of more... it's not quite as kind of moody as like a dungeon theme, which is why for like an overworld theme, it seems to fit more for me. I do need to lock down a first dungeon theme. I got a couple potentials in line for that I haven't quite decided on yet. This one could function as a dungeon theme too. I just think it's not quite dark. Sour Lad says Lego Citizen. You have given me more information that has explained nothing, Sour Lad. I'm just going to assume this is a meme that I don't know. Okay, so that's the overall theme we wrote today. Oh, Chainsaw Man. Is that something from Chainsaw Man? I need to finish reading Chainsaw Man because I think it's done. I need to go and finish up what has been released. Iconic says, yeah, which is why I made sure to say first, like, not too dark, but your adventure begins. The definitely for the tone of this one, it sounds like something you'd hear towards the beginning of the story, for sure. I just haven't quite figured out exactly where I'm going to put it. Because I have to compare it to last year's overworld theme stuff too, and make sure it's not too close. But that's the first one we did. So let me go figure out where I saved the one before this. Is it this one? Oh, that's convenient. Okay, I have to re-enable mic boosts on this one. Because it was recorded off stream, therefore it doesn't have the boost enabled by default. Charlotte says it's a YouTube video. All right, if you haven't already, you can always share it in media share so I can look at it and then I'll understand the references. All right. So this is a different one. This is also a potential overworld theme. This one I did off stream. So let's take a listen. So I still am playing around with the order of which I'd pull up everything on this one, but I more or less played it in the order that I think it's going to be performed. I might make some changes later, but Iconic says, oh, this is very relaxing. So this one, similar ideas. There's some kind of similar instrument choices and melodies, which is why I wanted to set up that other overworld track to be kind of similar in nature. This one, again, has more of a march tempo, so it's a bit more energetic in the tempo of the rhythm. And so potentially, I do want to use this for the project in some capacity. If I didn't end up using this one as an overworld theme, it also could be a good epilogue theme or like an ending theme because it sounds kind of victorious. It's got higher energy and it's kind of uplifting. So if I didn't purpose this for like a overworld theme, this could be the closing theme to a project as well. You know, when the credits are running, the heroes are kind of marching home, having, you know, vanquished the big bad. It sounds kind of triumphant. Like says, yeah, end of chapter perhaps. I don't know if this would work great as like a part B bridge to like a second act, because it sounds, the victoriousness of it sounds like you wouldn't want to put it before other events, because then it would seem like things are ending before they're actually ending. But I'm not ruling out the use of this one for like an overworld theme. It was definitely inspired by the overworld themes of Breath of Fire 2. In fact, I had to be a little bit careful not to pull in actual melodies from Breath of Fire 2, since I really like the songs in that game. But having the kind of driving force behind the rhythm sounds like a march. It is a march. That's a march type of rhythm. But I will probably finalize this one and the one we did today, record them, and then think on them a bit, and maybe get some second opinions from people I know, and we'll see. But I think both of those themes are going to make it in. I just don't know what capacity yet. There's still some things I need to get done by the end of the month for that project, which, again, I can't really talk about right now because it's very preliminary, but I made some headway over the weekend. I recorded some stuff that I think turned out decently well, and I think you folks will dig it once you get a chance to see it. Unlike Lost Kingdom, which came out at the beginning of the year, the one I did with Wazi, I'm going to be a bit more tight-lipped on this project that's coming out next year. I've shown you folks 2 tracks essentially here, and some of the other streams we did some battle themes that could make it into that. But I'm not going to be previewing a lot of the tracks before. It's going to be a bit more of a surprise. So after today, I'm probably not going to be giving you a glimpse into that too much. I'd like for it to be a bit more of a surprise, but it should be interesting. That one probably won't be out till the spring of next year if everything goes according to plan. So there's other releases between now and then that I'm planning. We have Halloween coming up. I am tentatively looking at doing the release party for the Halloween album next Friday. Got to line up some scheduling, and it'll be on the posted schedule before the end of the day today for sure. But after that, there's another one that I'm looking at, maybe beginning of 24 in the winter. There's another one that I'm looking at putting together. And there'll be more to come on that one too. That one's going to be an electronic project. So some of these things that we've been fiddling around with here on stream might make it into that one, because it's not like a dark Halloween type project. But we'll see. We will see. There's plenty going on. But I think we will call that a good stopping point here. Let me go see who's online to raid, and we can spread some good vibes elsewhere. I see Lib's live. I haven't had a chance to raid them in a while. So we can go see what Lib is doing. It says special events. I don't know if that's a tag or a game. But let's go say hi to Lib and their community and say what's up. So let me cue this up. We will go ahead and mute you and go to outro. Oh, is it a subathon? Okay, let's go in and try and boost up Lib's subathon. That's what they're doing. That's cool. But in the meantime, thanks to everyone who came and hung out. Hopefully all the discussion on beatbox technique stuff was interesting. I know we talked a lot about technique. So if you ever want to refer back to that and look in the archives, it's there. But yep, hope you guys all have a good rest of your Sunday. And now let's go see what Lib's up to.